Unfortunately, work commitments preclude me from preparing a full video for this week, so in its place, I present a presentation I gave on the 22nd of June 2021 to the Royal Arch Study Circle of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Queensland. It's a video of a Zoom presentation, so I hope the quality is okay, and where I've been talking out of my hat and making false claims on the way through, I've added some pop-up notes to correct the more egregious errors.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation from the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
Is that any better?
Yeah, that's it.
Full screen, excellent. I can't see anybody now, so I'll fly blind and pretend you're all smiling at me. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present tonight. This isn't anything particularly deep, but it's something I've been thinking about for a number of years, which is doing up a timeline. I've called it a timeline of Masonic history. I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago about the Blue Lodge timeline. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of events that are mentioned in our rituals. There's a lot of characters that are mentioned in our rituals. And I thought it'd be fun to try and map those events and those characters to what was going on in history at the same time. So in the first degree, did that slide just change for you then?
Yep.
Great. In the first degree charge after initiation, it says ancient, no doubt it is, having existed from time immemorial, about the craft. So I was thinking, well, what does that actually mean? What is time immemorial? And what does ancient mean? And who are we actually talking about? Because there's an awful lot of names, as you'll see shortly when I get to the Royal Arch. I wanted to try and put them in some sort of historical context. So what does it mean that it's ancient? What else was going on in the world while the events that we celebrate in the craft were taking place? I started from that premise. Then we hit a few problems. As soon as I started to look at this properly, there are a few problems with dating Masonic events. The primary one is that we all use different calendars. So today, conventionally, is 22nd of June 2021. If you're in the Royal Arch as we are, it's the 22nd of June 2551, Anno Inventionis. If you're a Knight Templar, it's the 22nd of June 903. If you're in the craft, it's the 22nd of June 6021. In the American cryptic degrees, it's the 22nd of June 3021. And according to a literalist biblical timeline, it's the 22nd of June 5781. All those different dates make it quite interesting trying to pull characters into what is actually a realistic time frame. The second issue that I came across putting the timeline together was what I've called textual misalignment. And that's that if you look at people who've put together timelines of biblical history, and the majority of the characters in our ritual are biblical characters, there are a huge variety of different timelines you can choose from. People may be familiar with Bishop Ussher, who put together his dating system back in the 18th century. He decided on the basis of his dating system that creation, he gave creation a date. Creation was, I think it was the 4th of April, 4004 BC at 9 o'clock in the morning or something like that. He came into a very literal interpretation of the dating. You can go through the Bible and you can look at all the years and the dates and the times and the ages that it gives to all the characters. And you can come up with what's called a literalist analysis of biblical texts. I've gone somewhere, as you'll see shortly, I've gone somewhere way along that line. The other people who also are very fond of putting together biblical timelines are people who are looking at prophetic interpretations. They will put together prophetic interpretations designed to suit their own purposes. So they'll say that the world is going to end next Tuesday, and they'll go to the Bible to provide evidence of that using their own dating systems. The third method you can use to try and get datable events out of the Bible is by looking at what can you actually date historically. And I'll go more deeply into what I mean by historically later on, but that's what's in the Bible that can be sourced and verified from outside the Bible. And it turns out that the first truly datable event in the Bible, the first thing that we can prove from external records, actually occurred at a given time was the destruction of the first temple in 587 BC. Before that, there are no firm dates, but from that date forward, everything in the Bible can be dated quite closely. And the fourth method is what I've used, which is a mixed method, where I've used a little bit of Bishop Ussher, I've used a little bit of historical dating to try and get to a realistic timeline. The result of that means that some characters, the earlier back you go, the worse it gets. Some characters can vary in date for 300-400 years for the same person, depending on whose timeline and whose interpretation you're using. Everyone with me so far?
Yep.
Okay, so on the basis of that, I put together this timeline, which hopefully is scrolling across your screen now. So I've gone through, it's got a few omissions because I've found more, but I've gone through the rituals for 3 orders, the Craft, the Royal Arch, and the Scottish Rite, and pulled out who were mentioned, when were they supposed to be alive, and what was going on in the world at the same time. And that timeline stretches from 4004 BC, which was the date of the creation, right through until this century, or last century, sorry, just prior to the turn of 2000. And the timeline itself, I won't go through it in detail, but the timeline itself can be downloaded and you can see how everybody matches up. And that's what I'll be talking about tonight. I'll start off just going back to the craft. This is a Royal Arch session, but I'll talk about what I talked about with the craft, because the first thing I did was go through the 3 degrees, first, second, and third degree, and have a look at what events and what people were referenced in those degrees that weren't in the room with us. So in other words, who are the characters that make up the craft degrees? It turns out that there are 29 events or characters in those 3 degrees. There are 19 characters in the first degree, 8 in the second degree, and only 2 new ones in the third degree. I mentioned there that one of those in the third degree is a cheat, because obviously Hiram Abiff is a very significant character in the craft. Hiram is mentioned twice, once in the first degree and then again in the third degree, but the third degree he's mentioned a little bit differently because it gives a different dating for him. So I put that's a cheat. So there's only 29 characters, events, people in the whole of the 3 craft degrees. So here's a quiz for everybody. Who do you think is the oldest figure referred to in the craft ritual? And Cyril and Shane Matthews aren't allowed to answer this.
Oh, I was just about to.
I know this. Who do you think is the oldest figure referred to in the craft, so in the first 3 degrees? Any ideas?
David?
Earliest. No? Cyril?
Sugarcane.
Yep, Tubal Cain. Tubal Cain is the earliest figure referenced in the craft degrees. He was actually only 4 generations removed from Adam, living at about, according to the timeline, which you'll see a bit later on, living at about 33.
That's right. Yeah.
Second question, what's the most recent event referred to in the craft ritual? This one threw everybody the other night. It's pretty straightforward. It's exactly 100 years ago.
UGLQ.
UGLQ. Every time we point to this is the warrant of our lodge under the United Grand Lodge of Queensland. So we know exactly it was 100 years ago. So the craft, if you look at it really literally in terms of who's referenced on the way through, you go all the way from Tubal Cain, 3300 BC, right through to the formation of the UGLQ in 1921. So I thought, okay, I'll do a Royal Arch one. Let's have a look at the Royal Arch. So I thought, okay, it's manageable, 29 events, 29 people. Let's have a look at what happens in the Royal Arch. For the Royal Arch, I've looked at all the degrees, from the Mark Master right through the cryptics, right through to the Red Cross, including the Royal Arch Mariner. It turns out there are 85 characters, 85 named people in those degrees, which made it all a bit harder to manage. I've divided them up, as you'll see in a minute, into mythical, legendary, historical, but there are 43 separate names of people in the Royal Arch degrees. There are only 4 named in the Royal Arch Mariner. There are 24 named in the cryptic degrees, and there are 14 in the Red Cross. So 85 separate names. And when we get to a bit more detail later on, I haven't memorized who they all are and what they do. I've just got the names and their dates. So same quizzes again. Who do you think is the earliest person referred to in Royal Arch rituals across those degrees?
Keep thinking of Methuselah.
He's not named though.
No, he's not mentioned there.
No.
Noah.
Noah.
Yeah,
Earliest
Noah.
name.
Oh, Noah.
Noah. Noah's only, I think, 200 years younger than Tubal-Cain, which we'll see shortly. And the most recent event referred to, very similar to the last one.
With the forming of Grand Royal.
Forming of the SGRACQ, which I've got the date a bit later on. I think it was 1921. I don't know, I've got it later on anyway. 1930, sorry. Yeah. 29th of January or something. So again, a massive span. The big difference with the Royal Arch is there's so many degrees and there are so many named characters. I left out events, I left out people, I left out populations, I left out places. I'm just going to talk about the people for tonight. All right. So I had to try and wrangle this, and there's a website and a YouTube channel which is run by a gentleman who's got a PhD in biblical studies called Useful Charts, and he just does timelines. He does charts for a living, and he has got a series of charts about Bible history, and he's made a very interesting distinction between what's a myth, what's a legend, and what's history. And I've used his sort of schema for this. So what I'm going to go through is go through all the characters in our rituals in terms of whether they're a myth, they're a legend, or whether they're an historical character. So the definition is a myth is an event that has no historical evidence. So if you look at, say, Adam and Eve, who aren't mentioned in our ritual, but Adam and Eve, we're never going to find any evidence of Adam and Eve having existed. Did they ever really exist? We're never going to know. They're totally mythological. They're totally mythological characters. So characters that are mythological, I've called them mythological. The second category is a little bit more contentious because that's looking at legendary. So a legendary character is a character who may well have existed. Certainly stuff happened in history that may have been this person, but there is absolutely no evidence that this person ever existed at all. Example of that would be King Arthur. Yes, there was stuff happening in England following the departure of the Romans and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. Yes, there's evidence there was some fights going on. There must have been a king of some sort who was leading the British resistance against the Anglo-Saxons, but there's no evidence whatsoever that there was anybody ever called Arthur who did it. So you'll find there's an awful lot of our characters fit into the category of legend. And the third one are historical, and these are characters that you can basically cross-validate with other sources. So there's archaeological evidence, there's other written evidence, there's other civilization evidence, there's inscriptions. In some cases, we've found the mummies or the bodies of these particular people, so we know that they're historical characters. So that's the frame that I put this into, the three different categories: myth, legend, or historical. So we'll start with the mythological, and I've just used Noah as an example here. There is no evidence that Noah ever existed. There's lots of stories about him. There's stories across multiple cultures about a great flood, but have we got any evidence that Noah himself existed? No, we don't. He's the 10th and last of the pre-flood patriarchs. A bit of a clue here is that he's supposed to have lived for 950 years, from 2900 to 1950 BC. So it's a pretty long lifespan. He's actually the second longest lived character in the Bible behind Methuselah. I think Methuselah lived to 975 from memory. But even if you look at Noah as a myth, the period of time that Noah was supposed to have existed and when the flood took place can be nailed down historically. We're talking about the Bronze Age, 5,000 years ago. It's the very early start of the Minoan civilization out in the Mediterranean on Crete. And the lifetime of Noah, if you look at him chronologically, covers off a huge swathe of Egyptian history. The early dynastic period, the Old Kingdom, the period of the pyramids, right through the Middle Kingdom, as well as almost all of the Sumerian empires and the Akkadian Empire and part of the Assyrian Empire. So just his lifespan mythologically covers an enormous span of time, nearly 1,000 years. The second type of mythological character, and this is a little bit more contentious, but it is mythological according to the schema I'm using, is all the events in the Bible that take place between Abraham and the Exodus. So it covers a 600-year period of time. Is there any evidence at all that we can find archaeologically that that anybody from the time of Abraham right through to Moses ever existed? No, there isn't. Moses himself is a case in point. There's copious Egyptian records from that period. We're talking about the period of Ramses II, who's one of the big pharaohs. We've got Ramses's mummy, we've got his tombs, we've got his inscriptions, we've got temples, we've got copious records of what was going on in Egypt at that time. Unfortunately, there's no mention of parting of the Red Sea, army being destroyed, plagues, frogs, locusts, the Nile turning to blood, any of the stuff that's referenced in the Bible. So the whole story of Moses sits in the mythological category until somebody finds something. The same applies to the story of Abraham, right through to the attempted sacrifice of Isaac. The stories are there, but there's no evidence that the person called Abraham ever existed. That time period is a little bit later than Noah. We're talking about 1,000 or so years later. And this is when the Assyrian Empire was at its peak. And so Egypt and Assyria were battling it out through the Holy Land for control of the Middle East. And it's the period of the Minoan civilization in the Mediterranean was at its peak. And I'll come back to the Minoans a bit later on. And I mentioned this in passing, but if Moses did exist, the most probable pharaoh with whom he was struggling would have been Ramses II. And I don't know if you saw, but just a few weeks ago, Ramses II's mummy was moved across Cairo and put into the new museum. So we've got Ramses pretty well nailed. All right, so in the timeline, let's have a look at what's going on. I've just put a little snip there of a bit of the timeline showing this period. Might turn on my little pointer. There's a laser pointer here somewhere. So we're talking a period roughly from about 2800 BC. Noah is the first character who comes up in the mythological period. And then you've got the three sons of Noah. That's Tubal-Cain just looking off to the side there, across to the sons of Jacob. What was going on in the world during this enormous span of history? Every one of these things up the top here is 100 years. During that enormous span, we're in the middle of what's called the Bronze Age. So bronze was the technology. Iron had not yet been discovered or invented. The period of the mythical period covers all of Old Kingdom Egypt, which is the pyramid building period. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 500 years in which Egypt was busy building pyramids. It covers the Akkadian Empire, Middle Kingdom Egypt, which was the period before we got to Tutankhamun. So Middle Kingdom was more of a religious period in Egypt rather than the building period. The Assyrian Empire, the Minoans I've already mentioned, and we just start to get into the early Persian Empire in this mythical period. So the characters are mythical, but the events are historical. Some of the events that are mentioned on the way through, I've mentioned at the bottom there, building of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the flood, the Tower of Babel, God's covenant with Abraham, Sodom and Gomorrah. Those sort of events are all mythical events that took place within an historical context. There aren't many historical figures that we know too much about then. There's the pharaoh Cheops or Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid. Hammurabi, who was the king of Sumer, who put the first law code up, and you can see Hammurabi's column, which is the first law code ever developed. And I had to put this last one in. There was a sensational, vicious emperor of Assyria called Tiglath-Pileser I. I just think he's got a great name. He was renowned to be the most vicious of the Assyrian warrior kings during this period. So that's the what I call the mythical period. Oh, now I can't get away from what I'm doing. Help. Right. So in our rituals, these are the characters who are named, who we have to refer to as mythical. I won't go through all of them, but you can see they're in the Royal Arch degrees. Dathan, Abiram, Korah, Moses, Jethro, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Uri, and the 12 sons of Jacob, so the 12 tribes, are mythological. The Ark Mariner only mentions 4 people, Noah, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, all of whom are mythological. There's no evidence of them. And in the cryptic degrees, Adoniram, Ishmael, Nethaniah, and Shekinah are not historically viable characters. They can't be validated in any way. Everyone still with me?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
So now we move on to the legendary, and this is where it gets a bit more complicated. So the legendary period is a period where we know something was happening. We know that we've got some archaeological evidence that something was going on. We've got maybe the ruins of temples, the ruins of castles, or the ruins of fortifications or something like that. But we don't have evidence of the people who did it. So the most prime example for us would be King Solomon. So the building of the temple around 950 BC, it's very hard to verify the temple, obviously, because where it was built is currently under the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So it's not the greatest place in the world to go digging. But it's almost certain there's a temple of some sort there. During this period, I'm going to go into it a bit more deeply, there were two major things occurred during this legendary period around 1000 BC, plus or minus a few hundred years. The first one is an event called the Bronze Age collapse that I'll talk about in a minute. And the second one was that this represents the change from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, right about the time when the temple was being built. During this time, historically, the New Kingdom of Egypt was just starting to fall apart. So the New Kingdom was the dynasty, the 18th dynasty that included Tutankhamun. They were just starting to fall apart. The old Babylonian kingdom started to assert themselves with people like our friend Nebuchadnezzar. And importantly, the Phoenician city-states, which include Tyre. So Hiram, king of Tyre, yes, Tyre did exist. Did Hiram exist? We're not sure, but Tyre was certainly there. The city-states were starting to get quite active at this stage. And that's important, as you'll see in a moment. I just want to talk about the Bronze Age collapse for a second, because that's a really significant event, and the timing of it is very close to a lot of the issues that occur in our rituals. The Bronze Age collapse was an event that occurred around 1200 BC, plus or minus, or between 1200 and 1000 BC, and the long-term, large-scale civilizations that had existed for thousands of years prior to that all collapsed in that very short time period. I'll put the map up there just to show you the part of the world I'm talking about. Yeah, I think it's in Danish or something, but anyway, it gives you the idea. So Egypt had been around for well over 2000 years at that stage. In this same time period, Egypt was attacked by people called the Sea Peoples. Nobody really knows who they were, but they were vicious enough and they attacked hard enough that basically the Egyptian civilization collapsed for nearly 200 years. So that's Egypt out of the picture very quickly. All these little flames here show cities or large settlements that burned down, and nobody is really sure why or how, but during this same period, within the same 100-year period, a lot of the major civilization centers right up and down the eastern shore of the Mediterranean burned down, right out through Cyprus. The Minoan civilization completely disappeared almost overnight during this time. And it was a major civilization that was over 1500 years old at this stage. There is a theory that's fairly widely accepted that there was a big volcanic eruption on the island of Santorini, which basically wiped out the civilization overnight. But certainly the Minoans are gone. And that also rolled over across here to the Mycenaean civilizations up through Greece, which also at the same time disappeared. But that's not all, because right through what's currently Turkey and down through the Fertile Triangle, you can't quite see it on this map, but right down through the Fertile Crescent through Assyria and what used to be Samaria, almost all of those civilizations disappeared at the same time. The only civilization that really thrived, probably because they were the most violent of the lot of them, were the Assyrians. But basically after the Bronze Age collapse, the way the world looked prior to 1200 BC was completely redrawn in a very short period of time, probably 100 years or less. That's important for our history for a couple of reasons, because there is a theory that the Israelites and the people of Tyre were actually quite opportunistic, because it's at the same time that you've got Jerusalem becoming a center and Tyre becoming a center. The theory is that the Israelites were up in the mountains to the east. When whatever happened through there, the sea people, whatever came through and burned out the existing civilizations, they took the opportunity to come in across the Red Sea and to take over more fertile land closer to the coast. The civilization of Tyre was a maritime civilization. So if assuming it was Hiram, king of Tyre, had a maritime civilization that was able to send its ships out and take advantage of all the chaos that was going on around the Mediterranean to build his own empire. So it sort of ties in a bit with with our timeline in our history, that the Bronze Age collapse was pretty much contemporaneous with the rise of Israeli civilization, the Israelites. Back to the timeline. So we're talking about a slightly shorter period here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 700 years. What's going on at the time? It's the transition between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So iron tools are starting to appear. The earliest iron tool ever found so far was actually found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and it's a knife that Tutankhamun had made of meteoritic iron. So Tutankhamun was quite early on for that, but that's the earliest Iron Age implement that we've got. The Hittite Empire was strong. The Old Babylonian Empire was strong. The Neo-Babylonian Empire started to come along as well. It was what's called late dynastic Egypt. In other words, the big kingdoms of Egypt had collapsed and there was a late dynastic period before we get to the Ptolemies and the Romans. And it was just at the very beginning of the Persian Empire. Some notable figures that were around at the time that we know are historical, or Pythagoras maybe not. Pythagoras is reputed to have lived roughly the same time as Isaiah in the Bible. Socrates came a bit later on. He's almost exactly the same time as Nehemiah. And Cyrus the Great, who obviously is a very big part of our rituals, lived around the same time as well. Those are pretty much the main famous historical figures in what I call the legendary period. And this is where it might get a little bit more complicated, because now I'm going to start showing you how many legendary figures we've got. Right. All of those names, I'm not going to go through all of these, all of those names are, according to my schema, are legendary names. So yeah, something happened. Did those actual people exist? We don't know, but certainly the things that are said in their name, there was something going on at the time. So you can see this is where the majority of the characters in the Royal Arch, the Cryptic Degrees and the Red Cross appear. And I can't remember, for the life of me, I can't remember where Ido comes in. He's there somewhere. Or Gedaliah. Now, all of those names are mentioned in the ritual. They all have to be considered as legendary because we don't have any direct evidence that those actual people existed. Any questions about that bit? I might flick past that because that's complicated. Done. All right, now we get to historical. This is a bit easier. Historical characters are datable. So I mentioned earlier the earliest datable event in the Bible was the destruction of the first temple. So the other characters that we've got in all of the Royal Arch rituals are datable. We've got historical evidence they actually existed. We've got physical evidence of them. We've got inscriptions external to the Bible written by them. We've got text written by them. So there's a lot of documentation for all of these. And unsurprisingly, most of them are royal figures. Because we've got lots of evidence this late on. We're only talking 500 BC. So in the last 2,500 years, there's a lot of written evidence of the existence of these people. Most of these characters date in the range from about 600 to 300 BC, which is the period of the temples. But there is incidental reference to a couple of characters going back as far as 1100 BC and even up to 81 AD. There's a passing reference to one historical character. What was going on in the world at this time? So from roughly 600 BC-ish through to about the year 0, it was the period of the Roman Republic and then later the Western Roman Empire. It was the late Persian Empire. It's what was called Ptolemaic Egypt, which is when the Romans moved in and basically took over Egypt as a client state. And some of the famous figures who existed this time, there's a lot of them. I'm going to pick a couple. It's the period of Plato, Aristotle, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, and of course, Jesus. Put my mouse back again. Right. So these are the characters who are definitely datable and historical and who we can identify in the ritual. There are no datable historical characters in the Ark Mariner because there's only 4 characters in it. But in the Royal Arch and the Cryptic Degrees and the Red Cross, Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned in all 3. So he was the second king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and he ruled from 605 to about 562 BC. Second character who's mentioned in all 3 of those series of degrees is, of course, Cyrus the Great, who founded the Achaemenid Empire. It was the first Persian emperor. In the Royal Arch, there is mention of Titus, the Roman emperor. Do you remember where Titus is mentioned in the Royal Arch? I didn't realize he was there till I found him. Yeah. Roman emperor from 79 to 81 AD. He's the person who sent the workmen to go and look for the, he's the emperor who sent the workmen to go and look for the hidden chamber.
Don't give too much. I don't want to know too much.
Nehemiah was governor of Persian Judea under Anaxerxes, first of Persia. So we know Nehemiah existed. There's independent records of him. Shalmaneser, he was king of Assyria from 1030 to 1019 BC. This is in the Cryptic Degrees. Shishak is mentioned in the Cryptic Degrees. He was an Egyptian pharaoh. He's usually identified as Shoshenq I. So the name's a bit different, but he was a pharaoh, and there's lots of evidence that he actually existed. And in the Red Cross, you've got Hystaspes, who was a Persian satrap, who was actually the father of Darius I. He's mentioned. Darius I is mentioned, and Jehoiakim, who was the last king of Judah. And he's one of the only kings of Judah where there is actually evidence because of some inscriptions by Nebuchadnezzar showing off when he destroyed Jerusalem. So those are all that's all we've got in terms of historically datable characters within all of our degrees out of the 85 characters we've got. So in summary, I guess, there's a vast array of characters. There's 85 characters, 85 people who make it up. I deliberately left out places and events and other things because that would have brought it up into several hundred, but there are 85 distinctly named people in that series of degrees. The date range covers about 5,000 years from Noah right through, the named characters go from Noah right through to Titus in the 1st century. And the most recent event, as I mentioned early on, is the formation of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Queensland on the 29th of January, 1930. Right, so I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
David, can I ask a question of you? You mentioned about the timeline for some of the ages of Methuselah and others, 900 years. Do you believe that they lived that long?
That's why it's mythological. It really is.
Yeah.
I can just bring this up now on the timeline itself. The old, do you mind if I just share the screen again? I'll just show you. Yep. Beastie here. This is the, can you see that? This is the full timeline.
Yeah.
When you start back, you can see the lifespan. So Adam's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 925 years old when he dies. Noah's 950 years. I didn't even put Methuselah on there. There's Methuselah, 975 years. The lifespans are immense. Enoch's only lives for 370 years, but that's because he was taken up by God when he wasn't even, he was barely out of his nappies. So as his history starts to take effect, you can see as I move across, basically from Noah onwards, lifespans start to shorten down to something that's a bit more realistic.
Yeah.
By the time you get into Moses lived to just over 100. So did Aaron. And then you get to Ruth and Boaz and all the other characters, and you're down to normal lifespans, 70, 80 years. So I think this is just very legendary, this early stuff. I don't know. I mean, if you take a literalist interpretation, you're a literalist biblical person, you'll go, yes, Noah lived for 950 years. But gee, you would have seen a lot.
I'm still trying to work out what the purpose of creating that type of myth about their ages.
There is a theory, and this goes back to, I forget his name now, but somebody I looked at. He has worked out that if you start from the destruction of the second temple, which is the first temple, sorry, which is Datable, around the 500s here. If you work back from that, bear in mind, because remember the biblical books, the books that describe this probably weren't written until 300 or 400 BC. So they're writing about something that occurred thousands and thousands of years ago. You can actually he's done it so the dedication of the second temple occurs on a specific date. And if you work backwards using the biblical times, then the date of the creation is exactly, I think it's 3,000 years before, to the day before the building of the temple. And he's saying, well, the biggest event in Jewish history was the second temple, the dedication of the second temple. So they've fixed the dates in the Bible to make sure it occurred on a particularly auspicious date. It's a bit of a cynical way of looking at it, but that's what his interpretation is. So he's saying, yeah, so they've made these days up back here. I wish Dave Lauder was online because he'd have lots of ideas about numbers. But certainly this gentleman's interpretation was that Adam was given a specific age for a specific reason to make the timeline work, so that by the time you got to this date over here, the second temple, they could celebrate in due form. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can see as it goes on, lifespans get shorter and shorter and shorter. You get to David and Solomon and Absalom and Rehoboam and Adoniram, and you're talking normal lifespans here. No one lives more than about 100 years by the time you get to here. And then once you get beyond, say, 500 BC, you've got real people with real dates that you can nail.
Any other questions, David? Okay.
No, just thanking him. Job well done.
It was good fun. I've enjoyed doing this one. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly not a question, but just a general comment. Very enjoyable, David, and
Thank you.
certainly shed some light. I'll read those characters a bit differently next time I do my ritual. Thank you.
Got to remember who they all are.
Personally, I can appreciate how Noah and the rest must have felt if they were that age, because at my tender age, I'm all aches and pains, so they must have been an absolute cripple by the time they got to that age.
Absolutely. And they were around for a long. Noah was still alive for the first 100 years of Abraham's life. He lived for a long time, overlapped by a long way.
Yes, interesting. Well, thank you, David. That was a
Pleasure.
very interesting presentation. It certainly expands from my point of view the history and the numbers and names that go with it. So a very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David.
For more Masonic podcasts, videos, music, texts, and artwork, visit fromthequarries.com or subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook accounts by searching From the Quarries.